All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to ActInf Lab, Livestream number 34.2. It's December 14th, 2021. Welcome to the ActInf Lab. We are a participatory online lab that is communicating, learning, and practicing applied active inference. You can find us at some of the links here on this slide. This is a recorded and an archived live stream, so please provide us with feedback so that we can improve our work. All backgrounds and perspectives are welcome here, and we'll be following good video etiquette for live streams. If you check out this Coda link, which I will post into the YouTube live chat right now, you can see a lot of information on past, present, and future live streams, and also more information on if you want to participate, because that's what a participatory lab is. If you're hearing this, you have the affordance to get involved. Today in ActInf Stream 34.2, we're going to be having our third discussion on the paper Free Energy Principle. It's not about what it takes, it's about what took you there, by Axel Constant from 2021. And we're just going to be having a fun dot two jumping off. We'll go over any parts of the paper that we want to look at, return to some of the formalisms, and then also we've written down a few questions specifically to address, but of course anything people raise or anything that people ask in the live chat, we can get to that. And usually it says next week we will discuss other papers, or we'll be discussing the same paper, but actually it's next year, because this is the last regularly scheduled weekly journal discussion that we're doing. And we'll have a little bit of an encore on this Thursday with 32.3, when Connor Hines will join for a dot three. That's kind of like the triple jump, the hop, skip, and the jump, rather than just the mere jump. But this is kind of the ending of a really awesome year of discussions, and we haven't quite set which papers to discuss next year. So if you have suggestions or you want to get involved in the .com's organizational unit where we make these kinds of decisions collectively, then just contact us through any channel. Okay. So we'll begin with an introductions and warm-up section, so people can say hello and they can address any of these warm-up questions, like what they're excited to talk about today, or just anything else they want to mention. So this should be fun, and thanks to everybody who's joining on the video stream and those who are watching live on YouTube. So I'll start. I'm Daniel. I'm a researcher in California, and I think today I'm a little bit excited about talking about how we got here, where we are, and then where we go. What does the free energy principle and active inference say about where we go? And I'll pass to Blue.
Hi, I'm Blue. I'm an independent research consultant in New Mexico, and I am excited to talk about the difference between living and non-living systems and where the FEP may come into play there.
All right, how about Dean?
Sorry.
I actually don't hear Dean. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry about that. I'm Dean. I'm obviously not fully awake, and I'm still warming up because I'm in Canada in the mountains, and it's snowing as we speak. What's interesting to me about this paper and about its role in terms of FEP and active inference is, so once we have identified the entailment problem, then what happens? And I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Hello, Stephen here. I'm in Toronto, and I'm interested in this reframing. I think this paper does. I think it's helpful. Maybe thinking about, where was I in the river of life when something happened to take me to where I am? Rather, it's sort of might be never fully known, but the principles might be useful. I like that, rather than this is the calculation of what happened which is that temptation. So I think there's something about that going on here. So look forward to pursuing that more. I'm going to pass this over to Dave.
The two things I'm excited about are that in this city north of Manila, which has roughly the population of Pittsburgh or Anaheim or Manchester, we had 1 new case of COVID yesterday and 0 today. And also, as soon as Daniel pulled his Pope Alexander VI routine and said, "When will you make an end?" suddenly Maria and I are just barreling through the redaction of the seminar. Who is there anybody
That's all.
else?
Yeah, Dave was just mentioning there the imminent completion of the Friston Symposium transcript, where we're taking the symposium that we had earlier in the year and enriching it into something that can be used for closed captioning, as well as translations and enrichment and connections to other aspects of our knowledge base. So that will be very fun. And it's also speaks to how we got here and where we're going, I think, because eventually we'll give that kind of a treatment to all of these live streams. And that will be quite interesting. So, Stephen, yes, please. I'm actually, because we're using a slightly different Jitsi, let's just get all of our emojis out of the way. If you go to the hand and then you do emojis, it does like, okay, oh, perfect. Disable sounds for all. Please disable it. Okay, now feel free to use emojis. You can signal by repeatedly clicking how shocked you are, for example, at what Dean says. Okay, Stephen, please.
Yes. Okay. This actually it works a bit more cleanly as well. I think this interface. I was gonna say that I'm interested as well. The question of scale. The question of scale. I think there's something in this. Is like we're saying it's not how you got there. Well, what scale is you? Is it scale free? Is it scale friendly? I know we've been talking about that, but is there is this you like the Royal One? Is it like a very broad term, or is it something that's like very much at the scale of an agent? Is it across scales, nested scales? I'm not saying this necessarily goes into that, but I think because I'm interested in, okay, taking this philosophical underpinning, which at first looks like it adds an extra burden or becomes a side issue for a more applied context, actually I think it does help just back up a bit. It helps back up, and in doing that backing up, I think it keeps us with that unifying principle approach rather than a unified theory temptation, which I think is what often happens to everyone, right? So I think that keeping it at that slightly more nascent understanding may give us a way to like understand the types of principles that could be seen to have played a part, which could therefore be seen to have been useful in other people trying to do something similar, which is not the same as a unified theory of why something happened.
Thanks, Stephen. Dean?
So what the paper brings out for me, and it kind of ties into what Stephen was just saying, is that you have an entailment question that you want to have answered. And now you have to think of that in terms of what's necessary and what's sufficient. If you look at that unidirectionally, meaning through the course of time as the flow or the river or whatever metaphor you want to apply here, if you look at that one directionally, that's going to kick out one version. And what this paper points out is that there's two directions at the same time. So there's a relationship between, meaning a different form of entailment, not one causing the other necessarily, but the fact that there are two, and now they are somehow relating to one another, which is a different animal. And so I think what I'm going to be really curious about in terms of the point two-ofness of what we're doing here today is seeing whether or not we can address what each one of those things, one unidirectionally through the course of time, and the other strictly relationally, in terms of how do two things that we know are present interact with one another. I'm going to be really curious to see what other people think might be the difference between those two different views, because I think that's what the author asks us to entertain, is not just the one, but both.
Cool. I think to Stephen's question about scale, I think it's also a important thing to keep in mind. So the example in the paper, which we talked about in the .0 and the .1, was this bacterium. So this is the toy example that shows that, first off, the differences between the Bayesian bacterium and the variational Bayesian free energy minimizing bacterium, and then shows how it's not simply sufficient to be minimizing free energy, but rather one has to be minimizing free energy with the appropriate priors. So it's not enough to be doing just Bayesian statistics. You have to have the right priors in order to make the right kinds of decisions. And then the relationship between free energy minimization and life is what is discussed as the entailment problem. So we talked about those earlier, so just go back and check if you'd like. But what is the scale at which the entailment problem is even applying? Is it the cell membrane of the bacterium? It just aligns perfectly with the physical scope of the agent? Or is it the colony of bacteria? Or is it the bacteria and its niche that has to be explained how it got there? Aren't we always going to have supra systems that are going to need their own explanation? And I think that really speaks to also what you said, Stephen, about the difference between the unifying approach versus the unified theory. This is like past tense. It's been unified. What else do we need to know? There's only one. Versus unifying is this ongoing process, and it's an approach where we might have some guidebooks or tools or memes for the road, but it's not over yet. We're still approaching some other question. But then how did we get that other question? Yeah, Stephen? And also, I don't think that people need to raise their hand. Maybe they can throw up an emoji silently because it still blinks a little bit. But I think if you just use, for example, laugh, then I'll see a flurry of laughter.
Oh, nice. And then I'll be laughing as well. I mean, that's not probably a bad thing. Make me a bit more cheerful. I've got this vision of these little faces now. There's something I'd be interested in a bit more on what you were just saying there, basically, because you said there needs to be more. I'd be interested in what people's thoughts are around what makes this helpful from an applied perspective. So, because I think one of the key things often in a more applied perspective is there's maybe the application of some kind of minimal model theory that's been shown to give a type of transitional structuring, for instance, what some cognitive agent who might be engaging with the world more like someone with autism, the nature of how they process sensory information or other types of situations. So that kind of general sense of the types of ways can then be used and maybe applied at a bigger scale. But generally speaking, you also, once you get, if the applied side of it is starting to go beyond a fairly low dimensional model and into these more complex real life, that's not the right term, but applied context, then these heuristics might be more broad. Like the unifying approach is going to be maybe more valid. And I'm wondering, how does the jump from a biological philosophy mindset that's informing this paper translate into those? So I'd be curious just what others' thoughts are on that.
Good question. How does philosophy impact or influence application? How do basic or theoretical biology questions influence the day-to-day and the way that different projects are carried out? Because it seems almost trivial to say that the projects that we're implementing, whether it's a road construction or whatever it is, it kind of has a biological component. It's by us or for us. And then it has a philosophical component, even if only implicitly in the top-down structuring. So we're talking about philosophy and biology. I think that's even what journal the paper is in. So then what does that mean for how we apply? And yeah, what else is part of the approach? I think these are interesting questions. Yeah, go for it.
One thing I've been very interested in, there's a new field by Michael Quinn Patton around principles-focused evaluation, which sort of extends his utility-focused evaluation and developmental evaluation, where your things are unfolding. So the evaluator is not evaluating after the fact, but is part of the strategic journey to see, well, what sort of you could say, in our case, what sort of free energy like minimizing instance happened that looks significant to the context. Okay, so it's not completely noisy, it's not completely unknown, yet it's complex enough that we're not following a rolled out system that's kind of relatively dead and relatively slapped down on the table each time like a piece of meat that's dead. It's something that's kind of evolving and going. And I think there's something quite nice here to that principles approach. You and what principles are going to be useful when you're looking at understanding if there were particular choices in the particular stream that happened to have been present that made free energy minimizing happen, or maybe when it didn't happen, when the agent didn't manage to make the choices and things started to unravel. That could also be interesting, because often it's more interesting to see, you don't really know which one made the difference when something has been kept on track, because it never fully spiraled out and magnified. But what were the times when something went wrong? Or can we find out, trace where that perturbation that started to rock other parts of the system of interest came from? And that might be where this type of work ties in as a thought.
Daniel, can I ask a question without raising my hand?
Yeah, I think we can just go for it in this one.
So here's my question, and it ties in directly with this paper. I don't think the author is asking in the generic sense which came first, the chicken or the egg, any more than I think when he's looking at an entailment problem, which came first, sensing or acting, which came first, internal or external, which came first, in all aspects of the philosophical sense of what's the relationship between internal, external, sensing, acting. I think what trips people up and what gets them on that unidirectional, linear kind of approach is asking what's first instead of holding up the relationship between and then seeing what falls out the other side. So if it's an entailment question, is internal necessary for external? Linearly speaking, you could make that argument, but I don't know that that necessarily holds then if you're saying, does external then make necessary internal? However, if you look at it as a relationship between internal and external, both are necessary. So one can be satisfactory for the other if you're looking at it unidirectionally, but if you're looking at it bidirectionally, now all of a sudden the frame shifts and both become necessary in a relationship in order for the relationship to continue forward. So I think for a lot of people, asking which came first, the chicken or the egg, from a relational standpoint, doesn't matter. They both have to exist for the question to continue. Not which came first, but do both exist? And I think that's the entailment question that this author is asking us to at least contemplate a little bit. Are we holding ourselves to one view, that unilateral view, when really what we should be doing is looking at the relationship and what entails the other as being either satisfying or necessary?
Great. Stephen, thought on that?
And sort of following on from Dean there is maybe is like you say, that when we get into do they exist, now we're into the structural stuff. We're into the structures where action and interaction happens, as opposed to a meta system of egg and, there's a structure. And I suppose the question can also be is, do they sufficiently exist? And at what point? So for instance, at what point, maybe through pollution, lack of calcium in diet, kinetic impact, are they no longer sufficiently persistent? And suddenly one of the eggs can't make another chicken. Okay, so that could become, that then maybe is out of the, how did 50,000 eggs get made? Well, maybe it's more useful. So, at what point did 0.1% of those eggs not continue? What was then outside of the pullback attractor, or whatever way we want to say it, that was needed to keep it within a viable living trajectory?
So one kind of funny answer to which came first, the chicken or the egg. From an instrumentalist perspective, you go, oh, in your sentence, chicken. Just that's the answer. The way you spoke that question, it was chicken. If someone said, well, what came first, the egg or the chicken? Okay, then the egg came first in how you asked it. So what came first in your model? But that question smacks of realism. We start thinking about the actual way that things might have played out, and is it more the case that there was a chicken? That's the realism question. And then when we take this relational instrumentalist perspective, there are different kinds of time relationships falling out. And I don't know if these are the right words, but just a few of them. So one thing is about the internal and the external that Dean mentioned. The partition is simultaneous. When we do a particular partition of internal, external, and their corresponding blanket states, those are all co-instantiated at the same time in model time, or in the relational instrumental time. That doesn't mean that they had to have been coming into existence as actual external entities, whether that's static structural ontology or a dynamical process ontology. But once we're in the modeler's time, the partitioning comes into existence at the same time. And then we have things that are changing through time. So there's the intra-model ActInf formalism, like the subscript next to the letter. When we're talking about state at time 1, 2, 3, 4, that's within the model, within the ActInf formalism, changes through time. Then there's the extra formalism, like outside of the kernel of the model, which is the iterated modeling, which is also changing through time, because it's not like any program is just produced and then that's the final version. There's always an iteration process in the real world. So that's changes through time. And then somehow spinning that around, we actually get to this timeless and momentary relationship that's like the complex entailments, where we start to ask about the relationship that's actually not conditioned on a given moment. But I'm not sure exactly if that's the right way to talk about that, but there is something it's not time travel, but it's not just forward in time, but it's not merely reflection or memory on the past.
So Daniel, here's a thing to think about. If you start with the model, if you begin with the model, you start at near time zero even in the model that Axel brings out, it's simple then by its place in the time continuum. If you end with the model, it's got to be much more sophisticated because a whole bunch of things have happened. A whole bunch of new information has been available now to include in the prior. So I don't know that it's complex entailment happens the further out you wait for the model to appear. If you start with the model, you're going to get a different result than if the model is closer to the end of the loop closure. That's what this entailment question is actually surfacing for us. It's when the model. So where did that come from? Space-time means when the model. When did the model appear so that we close one loop and start the next update? That's where the sufficiency and the necessity part gets really strange, because it's essentially a space-time question. And if we include two arrows, we're now including space and time.
Thanks, Dean. Stephen?
And within that space and time, I think, as Daniel was mentioning, we can have these implicit assumptions just in the way we frame in our questions, which would be subliminal, but it's sitting there, right? Like you say, by even talking about things in certain ways, it privileges a certain type of thinking. And I'm really interested, even in this paper, we talk about what did it take for you to get here, okay? So there's also, it's almost like that picture of, like, you know, the beautiful puppy. It's like, and I can imagine asking, what did it take for you to get here, right? But there's also those really inspiring moments when you see the really sort of starved small dog that's kind of in a really bad shape, right? And I was thinking, what does it need to get back to there, or something like there, i.e. a relatively viable, healthy, thriving type of animal? So that's also, and I think that often is like the priors. In some ways, when things have gone out of kilter, there's a need, there's been a prior set of experiences which have been non-optimal, but hasn't killed the animal. Well, what priors need to be fed in to get back on track? Although the word track is not the right term, but to get closer to something. And even there, I'm struggling. I think this is where the ontology, should I be saying get back to a non-equilibrium steady state, to an attractor, to a thriving? And maybe it doesn't need to. At that point, maybe there's some concept that doesn't have to be in the free energy principle exactly. It's like some idea of a thriving type of organism. But that situation has taken the living entity away from the stream that would be desired, and has to find a way back, or it won't survive.
Lou?
So I was like, just to kind of hit on both what Dean and Stephen were saying, like, how did we get here? Like, I often think of here as like a physical place, but it's also like to this present time point. Or here, like, how did we become alive and get to this like non-equilibrium steady state? So it makes me wonder what Dean was saying. Like, here is also a when, right? Like, so what are all the things that brought you to this moment? And really, like, I don't know, like, so all of the circumstances that have made you in this present moment who you are, like whatever you are separated by your partition, like, is the present a part of the steady state? Like that's what makes me think of that. I mean, the present can't be like a steady state system. So it's because it's like always constantly like going forward. And so I don't know, it makes me think of that as an attractor. Is the present moment, can that be an attractor? Like, is that possible? Stay in the moment, stay in the present. When we think about mental action, like what does that mean to stay in the moment? Like, can that be like an attractor state? Like, is the future an attractor state? I don't know. It just made me think about that.
Certainly some kind of pull from the future is what's happening with free energy minimization in the physical Gibbs free energy sense. It's as if there's a pull from the future down the hill, but it's actually this sort of instantaneous movement of the reaction, yet it does act as if there's this long-term pull. And also maybe the necessity and sufficiency. So what does it take to get here? It depends how stringent we want to be with what's here and now, because even some tiny gravitational factor of some other planet or some object on the other side of the planet, it's safe to say that some molecule in a given body would be in a different orientation, even if trivially so. So then, is that going to mean that everything is sufficient? Like everything that it was there was sufficient to get us here, but also everything was necessary. Is that too stringent, or how loosely do we hold the system? And I think instrumentalism gives us an answer, which is just how detailed is our model, and then that's the level of stringency. Like, which variables are we going to include? And what precision will we have over those variables? And then just to the question about thriving, I guess that Stephen asked, whether that's in the ActInf ontology or not. So it'll be fun to find out what is and isn't in the ontology, and then translations or transpositions of memes from ActInf to apply to those other cases. So like, for example, the person looking at the puppy and thinking, here are the physiological variables that I can measure. There's the shine on the coat, and there's the blood sugar, and there's the cortisol level. That's my instrumental model. There's other things happening that I don't know, but those are the ones. And my preference for the attractor would be ... And so what policies can I take in relationship to this animal so that its attractor is now as if it's here in that three-dimensional space of shine and blood sugar and cortisol, rather than the current attractor that it appears to be orbiting. So then we can just talk about preferences and expectations and policies of the caretaker. And then we've kind of transposed this sort of like floating obligation for the puppy to be healthy, but then things do die. So we've transposed this kind of implicit philosophy around a floating obligation into a specific relationship and the policies that a specific caretaker and their model are going to engage in.
That's a good point, and I think actually this is when we find ourselves getting back into the core of what's the agent's journey in different contexts, and getting into that, and becomes contextual, and what's the expectations, what's the surprise. And when you're into the agent's journey, what was surprising or what's relevant out of all the huge amount of surprise that can be going on across all levels is kind of what becomes important potentially, because that becomes where choices were being made or not being made. And I think that when we talk about, or when often there's this question about the minimal conditions for life, that becomes a sort of false question, because it's in that kind of what's the minimal questions to get life. Now that's great if someone's applied active inference work is to create life from scratch, I can't see anyone doing that for a long time. So, however, if we want to know what were the key expectation, surprise, or policy shifts in a living entity that got them to this new living entity, because there's change, right? I've got the scars on my hand from maybe I cut myself with a knife and I had to heal. What were the kind of journeys on that route? And those are the things outside of a Monty Python foot coming down on my head, in which case I don't have much surprise because I'm gone, is what were those? That I think is more interesting. And that is maybe what this talks about, because one of the key things he talks about is structural integrity, how to resist the loss of structural integrity. He doesn't say how to keep the system going. Doesn't matter what we see the system to be. It's if it's acting, it's got structural integrity to be a thing with the ability to act. Whether that thing is now looked at as a system is academic.
In the discussion on the metamorphic systems, where the paper writes, it may be said that the life cycle that corresponds to the thing whose integrity is maintained over time is the process integrity, using Bucky Fuller's ontology, rather than the structural integrity. The structure of the egg is always being broken down. The larva is always breaking down. The pupa is always, the adult is always breaking down and forming, but there doesn't need to be structural integrity or the retention of change at any point. There's a higher order integrity in the reproductive process. And then that's the question is, okay, so can we just look at one nestmate? Do we have to look at the colony and the symbionts, colony and the abiotic niche? What is that life cycle thing? What's the thing's life cycle? Is that going to be like a realist answer where there's kind of one true thing whose pattern integrity is being retained? Or might there be multiple possible answers for which thing is having its life cycle maintained? So then there wouldn't be a answer for what is life or are things alive. It'd be model dependent. And I think that's what one of the things that we've wrote down to explore about, like, what is life? Obviously, classic questions. And how does the FEP and ActInf apply to all kinds of identified systems? Animate, meaning with activity and motion. Sentient, meaning with sensation. Inanimate, without motion. And then insentient, without perception. And yeah, which systems is it a slam dunk for? And where is it going to be? Where is it overpowered? Where is it underpowered? What changes would it need to be more adequate in those different areas?
Can I add something, Daniel?
Yeah.
If I'm a rock, without anthropomorphizing this, if I'm a rock, I can be now and now and now, or I can be then and then and then. But it would seem to me what the free energy principle tells us is there is some relationship to these living things, because they, whether they can articulate it or not, they have some sense of the relationship between now and then, whether then is in the past and they have a prior, or then is in the future and they have a projection. They're not like the non-living things, which don't require some relationship between time points. And I think that's one of the things that, again, Axel's trying to point to in terms of an entailment question. Yes, I can be in the moment and I can be mindful, but the only reason why I'm aware that I'm in this moment and not then in the past or then in the future is because there is something other than now. And I think that again, kind of speaks to when we can take this and look at it as bidirectionality as opposed to unidirectionality, just entropy carrying out what entropy does.
Thanks, Dean. Stephen?
When we think about this free energy principle applying, like Dean mentioned, entropy will be doing what it does. You mentioned earlier about the flickering flame. Okay, now if I've got a gas flame. Okay, if I maintain the input of gas, there will be a structural integrity of the flame over time. So the flame, at one scale with one perception of what it means to be a flame, it could be seen to be persisting. However, does that mean that it's time averaging, trying to maintain, if the lens is a flame-like structure, which maybe if coupled to our niche somehow we are trying to make it do that, but then becomes the question of where is the variational free energy being looked at? Is it about free energy minimization, or is it about leveraging the fact that there is a free energy principle happening? There is free energy minimization, but there's also just free energy variation. So I could look at that and I maybe get some insight by seeing the flickering flame, which isn't structurally, hasn't got that much integrity, but it has a form that is always changing, yet has a certain, some scale of information. I don't know if I should say scale of information or something, but some qualitative nature of information persists over time. Where is that flame in relation to? Is it just because there's a fluctuation that I can extract the information from the persistence and the variation, even if there's no inherent motion to reduce dissipation per se?
Interesting. I think that if we return to the entailment problem and the strong and the weak claims. So the strong claim, minimizing free energy is sufficient for life, the overly generous claim. And then the weak necessity, if the system is currently alive, which, as we looked at with that metamorphic slide, means that it has persisted in its pattern integrity, which I know it was used as structural integrity, but that's actually a static concept. It means that it minimized its free energy. So the flame burning is kind of the canonical free energy chemical minimizing system. It's dissipating literally the chemical potential energy, and it's described perfectly by the dissipation of free energy into its environment. And it's even that metaphor of like, oh, wait a minute, if you put a candle under a glass jar, it burns out the oxygen and then no more. Same thing happens with life forms that require oxygen to do respiration, which basically is just taking that big drop in free energy that you can get from high energy molecules like fats, and then just trickling that, and yes, making some heat, but also using it to structure other macromolecular systems, internal and external, that allow other fats to get eaten. So, yeah, Blue?
So I want to push back on Dean for a minute. He's like got me stuck in this like temporal, like, I don't know, zone. So you were talking a little bit about the relationship like a rock has now and a rock has then. But I was not clear. I want you to clarify. I'm going to really like push hard on you. I want you to clarify what you mean. Like, what is the difference there between a rock and something that's alive? Is it a relationship between now and then, be it past or future, or is it awareness of the past and the future? And how do you know a rock is not aware, or that a bacterium is aware? So can you clarify, like, what actually is like this now then Ness. Sure.
Sure.
Great.
So what I'm saying is I don't believe if you could, I said I don't want to anthropomorphize it, but if you could ask a rock, does it need both a now and a then? I think the answer it would give back is I need one or the other. I don't need both. And to the point about the flame, if I consider myself metaphorically to have a fire burning inside of me, if I'm an engine, I have to know that in order to keep the fire going, I have to bring in more energy. I can't just, like a candle, burn myself out. So I can't go unilaterally towards the conclusion. I have to continue to bring up now and then. Oh, I guess I'm getting closer to the end of my energy cycle. I have to now recapitulate and bring myself back up to that place where I can continue to burn energy. So that's why I'm saying, I think if we want to look at this from the standpoint of what is actually using now and then versus what can continue to exist in, and I don't know if the word is entropic, but a world of entropy, that's one of those things that we could look at in terms of what free energy principle is asking us to incorporate in terms of a relationship, not just the relationship between two objects in space, but the amount of time that's incorporated in that relationship, the now and the then. I'm not asking us to pin down what exactly that is. I'm saying let's hold that up as either continuing or not.
So, I think that a rock must have a past in order to exist in the now.
To you and your relationship with that rock.
Well, even for the rock to be itself, it didn't just appear out of nowhere, or did it? Maybe, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't think it has a self because it doesn't have a then.
Well, so perhaps what is necessary, or what is necessary for something to be alive, is a delta between now and then. Like a rock could have been a rock then in the past and could be a rock then in the future, but doesn't require any kind of delta between now and then, like any kind of change at all in its structure, although it does change, right? I mean, like pieces of it fall off and it crumbles away and turns to dust, etc.
Entropy, right? Yeah.
Right. So I mean, it does change over time, but it doesn't require that change. And so perhaps that delta is one of the things, like I need to be different now than I was in the past, and I need to be different now than I'm going to be in the future in order to be alive. Maybe.
Here's a meme it made me think of. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. It's like a book or whatever. Spot, it's kind of like a particle. We talk a lot about particular states. So eternal sunshine of the particle-less mind. Like, if you don't have a particular state, which is the internal and the blanket states, those are the particular states. If you don't have the existence of a partition, it's kind of eternal. It's just like an empty field. Now, that doesn't have to be a realist claim about like what was there before the Big Bang and or Genesis 1. It can just be like in the model before a partition and a time scale has been applied, there was no distinctions. But then once you engage a particular partitioning, then if it is going to persist through model time and then maybe more speculatively through real time, it does have to engage at least in looking like it's making adequate policy selection. Mm-hmm. So one rock, we're going to be scratching our heads over it for a long time. But then if we had a field of rocks, some of them would be, and then there was like one side of the rock field had some corrosive acid and one part didn't. Like the rocks that did take the policy to be on the other side, those would be the ones that would look like they were persisting. And so when we kind of zoom out to the population level, which is also what happens at the end of this paper, when we look at the population level of a similar type of entities, then we start to see the strategies that lead to persistence versus the ones that don't. So, like, when people think about the rock, I don't know, they rarely talk about other rocks and about differentiating which ones are more lifelike or less lifelike, but rather when you only have one reference point, you can't really have a delta. Dean?
Yeah, and this is where I think we all of us that are looking at this free energy and active inference thing can actually see a difference between 3 rocks on the ground and a dolmen. The now and then can be looked at 2 ways. They were just 3 rocks on the ground, and now they're stacked. There's a now and a then, but that's different than the partition between us as living things and those things that have now been reordered. And that's what this paper is asking us to look at. Do we want to look only at the way that the rocks have been reordered, or do we want to look at the now and then of our relationship to the rock? If we can include both, we get a completely different picture.
And of course, we even used the rock example back in the day, back in the .0.
Yeah.
So here was sort of the 2 lifelines or trajectories, because both the person and the rock got there. There was a how they got there or what it takes to get there for both. So here is a restatement of the point of the paper, which is our strange attractor. The simple point I make in this paper is that the free energy principle is not concerned with the sufficient conditions of existence, but rather with what must have been the case, necessity, given that you exist. It's not about figuring out what it takes to be alive. It's about figuring out what took you there. So here's the lifeline of another system. And Schrodinger's question, at least as it's framed, is kind of like asking, give me the binary. Is it alive or not? But that is predicated on us thinking we're alive. I think that's fair to say. It's not stated in there that humans are alive and that's my reference point, or I'm alive, or the writer of this article is alive. But that is a very different question. So figuring out what took you there is a different question than asking whether the past and the present and the future of the rock is alive. Now, both entities to exist in a dissipative world will have done something like minimized free energy, whether with respect to a complex boundary condition and a complex policy space like a human, or a simpler boundary condition and potentially a negligible affordance space like a rock. Like, it's almost like people talk about whether rocks are alive, but then are we alive? And we should have a little bit of an answer there, or what is alive? What scale are we alive at?
So can I add to that, Daniel? So if we look at lots and lots of those figures, and we see t, and then we see t plus 1, and then we see t plus 2, we can look at that 2 different ways now. Those are then, and then, and then, in a linear way, or we can look at it as then as in relationship to now. And again, that's what I think Axel is asking us to contemplate, is both. If we look at it simply as then and then and then and then, I could be a rock. But if I'm now relating it to some other time point, that's when whatever else free energy principle speaks to, it says it isn't just another point on a continuum. It's in a relationship with something else. And I think that's what makes it really interesting in terms of the entailment question. What's necessary and what's sufficient? because you can actually look at it as another point on a continuum, and it actually kicks out as sufficient. But if you look at it as a relationship to, for example, now, it becomes necessary. And that's I think, without going too far off on a tangent, that's kind of where it gets really interesting. It's how you are looking at it, because there's a you asking, how did I get here?
So I modified the slide a little bit. Now the living red line creature, so we're just going to say alive like me. That's the kind of one that matters, in the sense that it has a quasi-crystalline aperiodic information structure and it's negentropic. Those are the two answers that Schrodinger provides in 1944, What is Life? And we just can't ignore this. This is where we're looking through our lens and our perspective on the system. So it's not like we get a sort of transparent look at, or an objective or a monolithic look at the rock. It's through our perception of the past, present, future of the rock. And that's where like the specific time scale that we choose to model it at. Because if you speed up the rock, it's just going to be burning like the candle. Now, maybe that takes like millions of years just as the surface reacts with oxygen and gets oxidized, but isn't the candle oxidizing? And then weren't we just talking about how we were oxidizing? And then maybe the special part of our systems is that we're doing like this or something, something like that. Like we're backcasting with our metacognitive model how we got here. Well, it's been this many years. Well, since what? Since the hospital signed your birth certificate? Or since you were conceived as a zygote? Or conceived as an idea? Or what exactly is that starting point? And I think that's kind of why the starting point here is just off the edge. Because again, we may never know what is sufficient. And sufficiency may include everything. But when we talk about necessity, we can actually do counterfactuals, we can do loss of function experiments. Necessity can be explored for complex systems in a way that sufficiency may never suffice. Blue?
So, like you were talking about, since you were, born, conceived, since you were an idea, but what about like since you were recycled from like previously existing organic matter? I mean, literally, we are all stardust, right? So, like, there's somehow some kind of partition gets created around us, like at conception, at birth, at when, right? Like, so this whole temporal thing is very interesting, and it's like, would you exist? Could you exist without a mother or a father or someone to care for you as an infant? Like, no. But I mean, and that distinction is very different for different life forms. Like bacterium, they don't need any care. They just, but is perhaps like the reproduction, like the act of even binary fission, is that sufficient care? Like what does that relationship look like in life and in aliveness? And we talk about like one of the necessary qualities of life, or I mean, I'm not sure. We can look at if have they changed, but like the ability to reproduce oneself is one of the necessary qualities for being alive. And lots of things we produce that are not considered alive. Like, I mean, lots of things. So viruses, nanobots, I don't know. It's interesting. Sorry, I'm like off on a random tangent.
Yeah. Thanks, Blue. Dean?
Blue, I don't really think that's tangential. I think without collapsing to like first year philosophy classes, the fact that we can hold up two things as important. One of the things that's important is which came first. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out order through that lens. The second lens is there's a here and now and a then. It doesn't matter which came first. It's just that we understand that the two things are different. That's the second lens open. They don't play well together, because the one that wants to figure out the order is literally trying to find a source. The other is just saying, we're not going to collapse to one. We're going to hold up two things as long as we possibly can. They're bad playmates. We shouldn't put them on a play date because they're inevitably going to fight with one another. But if we have both of our eyes open, what does that say then about us being able to get a better grip so that we can let go when free energy principle is included or incorporated in these sloped moments? Because I think it's the two, the figuring out which came first, and here's the relationship between the two. It's not one matters more than the other that creates the actual slope. That's where, as I said, I don't want to turn it into a philosophy course, but I don't think that's a tangent. I think that's what we're trying to reconcile, because we called it a tension. We can call it a, they don't play well together, whatever. But the bottom line is that as long as we understand there are multiple arrows, sometimes we can break them up as then and then and then and then and then. And sometimes it's about the now and then. And I think that's the part that for most of the stuff that we've seen in terms of how it's represented, it's, as Daniel pointed out, it's that spontaneity of partition part that we have to also include. And if we do, doesn't make it any easier. They still don't get along, but at least it tells us what might be at play. That's why I keep coming back to play. It's uncertain who's going to win out in any particular moment.
Well, I think like while we're discussing I think when was the partition created is important. And like, I mean, in something like binary fission, it's pretty easy to see, like when the two, cells separate and become, by a certain distance, by any distance, that's when, the partition is made. And perhaps that's true for all of the reproducing things, or perhaps not. I mean, I don't know, like the chicken is separate from the egg, right? Going back to the chicken and the egg, but they separate very early. So like the maybe the physical separation isn't sufficient. Like at that moment, you don't have your own partition because the baby chick or the egg could not fully develop without the mother chicken sitting on it, even though they're physically separated. So it's this really sticky situation. Like when is the partition made that makes someone an individual? And that's why I always go back to that David Krakauer paper. Like when there's a bidirectional information flow, upward and downward, and that's like what makes you an individual. And so like I don't know that a developing egg has that bidirectional information flow yet. Like maybe there's no downward causation in the egg. There's no ability for the egg to act on its own other than do anything except develop. Like the capability for action or like the downward causation. Like an egg is still in this it's still going through emergence, but you have to have both, like, emergence and downward causation for individuality to exist. I always go back to that. So I don't know, in a rock, is there downward causation or emergence? Like either one of those things? Do those exist? And so that paper like just nailed it for me for what I don't know that it's necessarily the answer to Schrodinger's question, but I think it does a good job of getting us somewhere.
And I completely agree. And I guess what I'm suggesting is entanglement is a feature, not a flaw. And we can and in that entanglement feature set, we can look at order, right? And which came first, and we can look at relation. And so I know that if there was an entanglement, even though it's multiple light years away, that entanglement tells me what the spin is, and it's not the same direction. It's an opposite. It's a polarness, right? So I agree with you. And I think that's the feature here. The feature here isn't we can only do one or the other. The reason why we're even speaking to this is because it has to be both in order for that slope to eventually model out. Like, I'm a big fan of model at the end. I think that's way more sophisticated because I'm prepared to let the order and the relationship hang for a while, breathe a bit, do some back and forth, scrap, UFC, punch one another. And then I get my model at the end. Now, I understand why model at the beginning, but I don't think that's the only way to go. I think if we can do model at the end, that's even more sophisticated because we have now included more. It's complexity in play.
Let's return to now V3 of our figure. So the colors are subject to change. All right, but red is realism, blue is instrumentalism. Our favorite statistical instrument is the ActInf process theory, which is a corollary of the more axiomatic, more general, less applied free energy principle. And then this is another system. And the system of interest in this paper was a bacterium. So whether we're structural realists or pretty much any stance other than the most hardcore denialism, we exist. Like, if we're not alive, then what is the conversation to be had? But when we ask, how did I get here, which is really happening, or when we look at another system, that's also really happening, those are real events. But both the reflexive question and the exteroceptive scientific modeling question are going to get filtered through instrumentalism.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's some way out of that. It's kind of like the difference between saying, well, you can escape Plato's cave, but then can you escape like using your eyes or using your generative model? It's like a whole nother level of cave. And then we have like ActInf and the free energy principle, this classic figure, organism and the environment. And then that is shown in the case of a brain, as well as in a bacillus, that particular partitioning about how we can think about the perception, cognition, and action and impact of autonomous systems. Once you're past the veil, you're all within your instrumental model. So that's where the question, like, well, what were those priors in my Bayesian bacterium? And then the future is unknown, because we can say, well, in my model, the bacteria is minimizing free energy. Or I'm talking about this bacterium, and I think physical systems minimize free energy. It's a physical system, so I think it's going to minimize free energy. But as we established in this paper, free energy minimization isn't sufficient to be alive. It's not sufficient to persist because the candle's minimizing free energy too. So we don't know, just because it has existed and is minimizing free energy, that it will exist in the future. So that's kind of the unknown. And then once we're post-partition, we're all in the instrumentalism world. So even the framing of what is life, it's an implicit realist playing field versus how do we model life? And then the answers that Schrodinger provides, look for the information-rich, according to your information theory, quasi-crystal structure. Or look for, using your thermometers and your heat sensors, look for systems that appear to be locally creating order, but then creating disorder surrounding them. I don't know if anyone really denies that those are good ways to study life, or that those are heuristics that can be applied. It's just like saying, well, your instrumentalism doesn't align with my realism. Okay, but what is your realism, and who told you about it, and how'd you find out about it? What are you going to do about it? What instrument are you going to use to investigate it? So it's interesting how the paper shines a light on how the entailment problem is really linked to some of the biggest themes that we talked about this year with realism and instrumentalism. Because again, the entailment problem runs through and through. What do you think, Dean?
Yeah, I would say that nails it, because if you want to look at it as which is more important, realism or instrumentalism, fine. But if you're looking at the relationship between realism and instrumentalism and how they relate to, that's going to make a fuller picture. Doesn't necessarily make it a cleaner, simpler picture. In fact, it makes it a messier, more complex picture. Oh, well, sorry. There's a relationship between those two things. Get over it. Grow up. Time to grow a nice long white beard and smile, because guess what? It ain't going away just because it's more complicated.
So I have a problem with, like, I don't know, realism overall, because, like, what is even real? Like, I view the brain as just an instrument through which we, act and infer. Like this is it. And every living system in my mind has like this kind of computational input output that they use, but it's an instrument that they use. And like the idea of realism is very icky to me, because it's so subjective. Like, what is even real? I just don't, I can't buy into the notion of some kind of shared reality for anyone. We all have different affordances, different preferences. Like, I don't even know if I see the same color when I see yellow that Daniel sees or Dean sees. Like, well, how I perceive yellow can be totally different from how you perceive yellow. And that's why we all have different colors, like favorite colors, right? Different colors that we like more and like less. So, and people are colorblind, and so we know that it's just not that way. So I don't know. Like, it's all instrumentalism in my like world. Like, we're instruments. I don't know.
I think it returns to the unifying approach versus unified theory. We've been really mired in the mix-up of realism and instrumentalism. And it sometimes is very slippery, like how things are. But then that's the twist with the theory of everything. And all the free energy principle for a particular physics and all of that, it uses sometimes even some of the same terms, like thing. But then by thing within the ActInf ontology, we might be referring to this particular thing, so the blanket and the internal states, and this particular thing is a cognitive model of. And then could we have a model of those kinds of things? Maybe. But could we have a model of the real things, or would this always be a sort of blurry discussion because everybody would be talking about their model anyway? And it's also a lot like the layers that existed in 32, which we'll return to in 2 days, where there was the Lorentz system. That's like the realist system. Now, it's one that we define, but it's really that way. The time evolution of the Lorentz system truly is defined by those equations that were granted to it. So that's sort of the realism claim. And then there was a first and a second order approximation to it, which are also things, but they got cleaner and cleaner and more tractable as we instrumentalized the thing we were looking at. And then the question is always, well, how much of the attributes of the real system does the instrument retain? Do we retain false positives, like kind of things about the territory that end up not helping our map? Do we have false negatives, like we simplified the map a ton, but we ended up missing really important features of the territory? And if the territories are complex, as we suspect they are, to have persisted this way in an egentropic world, well, if they're complex, then how will we thread the needle with the appropriate coarse grainings as not to include false positives and false negatives in our map? Because just having the full description of the system is not going to be useful. And then anything simpler, we're going to be at super risk of dropping features that matter. And so 32 showed that it was possible just at the mathematical level, for example, to make an approximatable Laplacian approximation, so tractable Laplacian approximation, but still retain the Lyapunov exponent characteristic of a chaotic system. So we abstracted, or we made approximations to, but we still retained one of the essential features of. And so maybe it's going to be harder to do that to a bacterium than a Lorentz system, because the reality of the Lorentz system is just numbers, whereas the reality of bacteria is something probably different. But it's a similar kind of question, and maybe we have some of the early versions of the tools that we would at least want to have in the future. Dean?
Yeah, and I'm not defending either realism or instrumentalism, but I think in this paper and that paper, which we're going to go back to, if we used real or realism, what they both point to is we can get it really right, or we can get it really wrong, or some degree of that. I think that's where realism as a concept comes in. It's not an absolute. It's not a truth. It's the variable as opposed to the instrument. The instrument is trying to find out the precision, and reality is about imprecision. So again, it's the relationship between those two things. I'm not looking at realism in the classic definition of how other people see it. I'm comparing it to the instrument, which is trying to gain the precise. And then, so what's the not precise? Okay, I'll just throw that under realism for now. That's how I square it.
So Dean, we're on the same page then, because like accuracy is irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So I don't think you and I are apart or even remotely, distant, but it's how you see that relationship. If you frame it one way, something kicks out. And if you frame it a different way, something else kicks out. And I'm not going to tell people who frame it the other way that they're wrong. They're relatively safe in their frame, but it's got to be two frames at minimum. Otherwise, we're lost. We're a stone, per se. We're just going along for the ride, and I don't know that that's fair to stones.
Well, I don't know that we have any other choice but to go along for the ride, honestly. I mean, like, and this goes back to, the discussions that I've had about free will. And I discussed this with Mike Levin. And I mean, really, like, if we are just the sum of our generative model, like if that's just us, we have no choice but to act accordingly. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us.
Blue, how's your...
the confusion's built in. Sorry. I just wanted to say, I think the confusion is built in. I think the uncertainty part of this is built in. We know that our demise is near. We just don't know when. Right? And that's why I keep coming back to how did I get here is essentially asking when. And that goes back to way back when we were talking about people with Alzheimer's and the hippocampus integrating where and when.
Yeah. And the grid cells and the mirror neurons and all kinds of ideas that people have framed that are instrumental takes that blur the line because they're about real systems, but then we can bring a little bit of an ActInf flavor to it. So I have one note, then a question. So here's the red living system. Now it's shrunk and turned into an image. And then here's the orange person studying bacteria. So now it's like the blue and the orange person, they can be having a conversation through the scientific literature or on a live stream or whatever. Like, this is where we start to go from that rock, is it alive or not, to here's a population of rocks. Which ones are succeeding at being lifelike versus failing in terms of their dissipation? So now here we have at minimum 2 people looking at the bacillus, each with their own auto-reflexive timelines. And maybe the orange person doesn't like ActInf. That's fine. They're using some other framework, but they're not breaking out of the instrumentalism trap. They're just doing some other instrument, and then they're looking at the bacteria through their lens. And then there's a conversation to be had. But it's almost like the more layers, the more super systems you add here, it starts to be like, I don't know, less and less about the bacteria. And, oh, well, in your culture, you were raised to think this way about this kind of scale or this kind of system. And this is an interesting conversation, but it's still nucleated around that bacteria and the model. And then, Blue, my question for you was, over 21, how has your feelings on free will changed?
So like, after I'd say like the real like mindset change shift happens more like at 25, at least for me. But I don't know, like, I think that the whole experience of being a teenager is like identity seeking and like putting yourself under the illusion that you have free will, or you have like such a desire to have free will that there's I mean, like, that's what it is to be a teenager, is like you go through this like identity crisis and then you liberate from the parents, right? And so I think that there's that, like, I definitely experienced that, if that's what you're asking.
So you already underwent the phase transition.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the phase, like, I already, yeah. I think, as teenagers, we have like this illusion of and desire for freedom that is like what we're supposed to have and feel at that phase in life in order to break free. And maybe the age is irrelevant. I mean, maybe in some ancient prehistoric cultures they felt that at 10. But the point is that the desire to, is it physical separation or to solidify your own partition, right? Like the desire to be your own independent person. So I think like I thought that, freedom and free will existed at that point. And now like, I mean, I feel like we're essentially enslaved by our generative model. We're enslaved by the past and the future in the now.
I think that takes us to one of the last prepared questions we had. One of the keywords of the paper was historical science. And we talked in the .0 about how there's all these historical sciences. You won't see chemistry, biology, physics, not those STEM sciences, but history, and then all of these other sciences that draw data from records of past events, as opposed to experimental or operational science. But asked it then and asked it now. Aren't experiments in the past? I don't see how merely having hypothesized and planned and then acquired data, when you're analyzing it, it becomes in the past. So somebody who's studying heraldry could hypothesize, oh, in this library, on this shelf, in this book, I might find something important, and I'll analyze it then. And then that data is in their past. So the historical sciences are contrasted with maybe what we could call the future sciences. So not like the future of science, which we hope is awesome and participatory and accessible and whatnot, but sciences about the future, which range from the sort of speculative and almost metaphysical to the extremely applied. Where do we sit now with historical and anticipatory or future-oriented sciences in the now? Dean.
So I'd like to try and take a first stab at that. let's use it. Let's use the free will question. If we looked at it historically as bring out the scrolls, this is what happened, or we look into the future and say, oh, this person's thought a lot about what's going to happen tomorrow. Let's build the scroll for tomorrow. That's one way of looking at the question of what is free and will. If we look at it as a relationship, we could look at it as free will or follow will, meaning I can't break free. I'm entrapped or whatever. And then what we could do is we look at the relationship as an ongoing exercise between free and follow. Now, neither the free or follow are going to fall neatly and tidily into a scroll, but they have a relationship, whether we scroll it out as a historical thing or we scroll it into as a projecting thing. But the ability to do both, not just examine free will as a linear question, but also be able to relate it to, so what is non-free will? It's like will follow. And then now compare the follow and the free, it kicks out a different model. One that's messier, one that's up for debate. And I think putting both of them up on a shelf and examining both is to look at philosophy, essentially.
So I think that I recently just learned that futurology is a science, which was super fascinating to me, like the study of predictive methods, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many ways that we have used to predict, but something that I thought was really, really interesting was they used to, before the internet was like trolled by bots, you used to be able to take like message boards and chat boards and like essentially Twitter streams, and I'm not sure how accurate this is anymore because there's so much like just artificially generated text. But when it was humans creating the text, they used to actually do text mining as like a study of the future.
Mm-hmm.
Like a prediction analysis based on text analysis. So it's and was very effective, so I hear. But I think that this like study of future predicting, be it oracles or astrology or what have you, is really kind of fascinating because you can use all kinds of things, active inference for prediction or anything, right? So I don't know. I think it's interesting to compare and contrast the different ways and the ways that if you're open to accepting insight from tarot cards or the I Ching or the Oracle of Delphi or active inference or text analysis, if you're open, I think that all of the future or potential future avenues can be very insightful. Like, that's a possibility, if only opening you up to the fact that that's a possibility. I think that's the real value in futurology.
Thanks, Blue. Dean?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the law of large numbers and the fact that we now have the ability to look at much larger data sets and apply probability and statistics to those things should give us some sense of direction that we probably didn't have affordances to before. And the messiness, and this is why a lot of times philosophers and scientists are in that same tension of relating to, is because that still doesn't collapse down to, I go and see my tarot card reader and he gives me an answer and I believe it. Because that's not a law of large numbers. So now, do I follow or am I free? I don't know. It's messy, right? So yeah, anyway.
Well, and does history repeat itself, right? Like there's the old adage, history repeats itself. Can we use history? Ooh, can we use history to predict the future?
Right.
That's where it sort of Mobius strips, strange loops around, when you make the model based upon the past that's anticipating the future, and then you start acting that way going forward in the future, it's almost like the timeline has folded, because now the past is influencing the future in a way that might start to diverge from, not like what it would have done. Obviously, any policy is going to diverge from some counterfactual, but it starts to potentially lose its model adequacy because events from the past whose context has changed, like let's just say the correlation between two cryptos. We look at the past correlation, but the context is changing. So we're going to have a model that's fit on their correlation in the past. And then especially action on that, but even without our action on that, that relationship may change. And I think that's something interesting about ActInf, that it puts perception, cognition, and action in the same loop, always unfolding, kind of like OODA, so that there always is the opportunity for flexibility as surprises come in. And then also what you were saying about like free will, freeing, following, and then to bring it back to realism and instrumentalism. Like, here's the free will module in my model. It's like, here's how it works. Here's what it does. Here's the inputs. Here's the outputs. So does the thing have free will? Yep. In my model, it does. What about the actual thing? I thought I told you. We stopped talking about that a few years ago or something like that. Like, we're not talking about that, or that's an interesting question, but now we're at square zero with what is real. Instead of, I made a hypothesis about free will module. That's just what I'm calling it. That's not a free will module. That's a random number generator. Or that's something that is doing its own prediction and then makes a decision based upon something else. Or that's like a preference vector. Okay, Dean?
Yeah, and again, today, I don't think it matters. I know most people would say it does, but I don't think it matters whether you start with a slide that has a blue silhouette looking at a gray rock, or you start with a slide that appears to be much more what's the word for it? Much more further along in terms of orange lines. You can go both directions. Yay. That's the thing that we should be celebrating. Like it may appear from a constructivist point of view, which came first, that there's no way that you could have started with the orange and ended up with the much less informational 10. But yes, you could. And we oftentimes do. That's actually, if you go from 13 to 10 in the slide deck, that is free energy playing out.
Yeah, we could look at this one and we could go, okay.
That's minimizing.
We're talking about instrumentalism, so we just know that when we draw an arrow of some agentic system, we know that we're talking about instrumentalism. And we know that the instrument that we're talking about is free energy principle, active inference. So that's how you step back from here to here. Mm-hmm. And then just go, okay, so, and then we know that models have their own internal time and that that's not the same as like real time. So let's just simplify that. And then let's just, a little bit less academic, not worried about which paper I should write. Let's just focus on the motivation of that paper. Is it alive? It's like, we step back. Now, I don't know. Is that, it's like backwards and forwards in Kairos as we move forward in Chronos, Dean?
And that's where instructionalism, and I forget what it was a Hippolyto paper, I think.
Yeah, interaction.
Instructionalism.
Skillful performance where the action is.
Yeah. That's where those 4 slides prove out her paper, her et al. Paper, because the reality is it's not simply constructivism. It's disentanglement. There's a product at the end of it that appears to be a construction. Don't get me wrong. However, what actually generates 4 versions, 4 iterations is a disentanglement, not an integration. And we have to be able to hold up both if we're actually going to get to a place where we understand how understanding emerges. And that's where I find this stuff really exciting, because if it's about interaction, here's the proof.
Let's, in the last few minutes, where do we go? So,
Not where we came from.
Or when do we go?
Mom, are we there then? Well, Blue, we'll be working on some fun literature analysis, the history of active inference literature and free energy principle, half 22. We hope to see many new papers coming in from authors that we know, as well as from new authors and new perspectives, and selecting cutting edge papers and recent papers that are coming out, and preprints, ones that might not be done, see where the live stream can insert itself into that literature stigmergy. Maybe go back to some earlier classics for contrast and understanding how ideas change through time and where we are now, who we are now, all these other variants of the question that we talked about. I mean, we're going to be doing it on Wednesdays next year, starting 1 hour later at, I think, 16 UTC at 8 a.m. Pacific. So for the weekly paper discussions or just any other system of interest, where are we going, or what will we do differently in 22?
I'm curious to see. We're gonna have our 40-second live stream. That's gonna be epic. We have to like choose wisely, choose a paper wisely, and also like our first paper of the year is gonna maybe set the tone for what we're gonna, learn and do and be about this year. What was our first paper last year in 21, Daniel?
It was Adam Safran and colleague 13.1. Let's look on the Coda site. We haven't updated it yet, but it was 13 on the cybernetic Big Five.
Oh, that was epic too. That was really good. And actually, like, the Big Five that was my first time learning about it. And it was kind of, we covered all of those this year several times. So we'll have to similarly choose like an all-encompassing first paper. Hopefully we go into more participation and more expansion and more broad acceptance or recognition of the FEP. I hope that's where we go.
That would be cool. Do we have any other comments, or we can give sort of a yes, Dean, please?
One last thing. I think I didn't come in. I wasn't there a year ago. But one of the things that has recently happened is that we've introduced another walnut shell, the potential for a 0.3, which I actually think for most people would be like, yeah, okay, so what? You're gonna stare at your navel longer. But I actually think it's a really
R.I.P. Dean.
Yeah. Dean, please, from the oh wow.
R.I.P. Dean.
Yeah.
But the .3 affordance is cool, so
Yeah,
that's a really good point.
Dean, the walnut shell, the navel gazing, the .3. Continue.
Yeah, I just was going to say, I think it's actually a really exciting time, because when we add another shell, we're actually practicing the active inference instead of just talking to it in different versions. And that to me is, if next year means that there's more reveal, more Q unknown, and we actually have to play with that uncertainty space, as opposed to walking into it and saying, well, we've now had this many live streams, so now we should actually be doing more shells, 1P and more options hidden. That's when it gets really exciting. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
So that's a super good point, Dean. And so if people have other live streams that they wish that they were a part of, or, you know, other authors want to come back for a revisit to do a .3 of any live stream that they've been on before, like reach out. We always have the affordance to make an anything .3. So yeah, like we can revisit old things and move on to new things and do both of them together. History, the weird folding, right?
Yeah, we can do guest streams, all kinds of fun stuff. And then also, just so people know, if you're ever part of a live stream, you'll see this slide asking you to go through a checklist. This is our 21 version, and we hope people go through it. I think sometimes they do. Lots of information on participation, on things to check before you start. If you're a participant, so not like the author of the paper, but just somebody who's going to be hanging out and giving any thoughts on a paper, there's some checklists for you. For a presenter, like an author who's going to be presenting a talk, there's information for them. There's also the broadcast role. So that's the person with a stable internet and a computer that can run a streaming software. There's a conversational facilitator. Yeah, exactly. Dean's Cabin .stream. We'll stream through a tin can. Then there's the organizer's checklist, and then we're always growing and changing as Active Inference Lab because we're a participatory lab, and that includes every single possible role, including many that are not listed here. So if it's something that you're interested in, and if you're listening and your regime of attention has extended this far, then maybe you'd like to join a live stream or make a suggestion or play one of these other roles, because it is a multiplayer game, and I hope we're having fun when we get to do it. So Dean and Blue and Steven from earlier and Dave from earlier as well today, always appreciated. It was an awesome year. I think we all learned a lot by doing and updated our generative models.
Thanks, Daniel. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Blue.
Thanks,
Fantastic
guys.
host.
It's been a good